as a community as well.
Welcome, everybody. The music has stopped, so we can begin. My name is Andrew Steer. I'm the president and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. The exam question for today is a really important one. Essentially, corporations and cities and even countries have made amazing commitments over the last few years. And they're doing their best, at least most of them are. It's actually quite difficult, and they're being criticized at the moment quite a lot for greenwashing. Even the Secretary General of the United Nations, accused them of pretty bad dishonesty. And in some cases, that's very warranted. In other cases, corporations are actually trying to do the right thing, but they're worried that actually, if they keep a high profile, they're just going to be criticized more and more, and it's almost a no-win situation. So it runs the risk of reducing the momentum that we had. So we want to have a very honest discussion about that. And we're going to focus on one sort of part of the issue, which is the nature agenda. And in the nature agenda, the issue is companies, either as part of their for-profit work or as part of their voluntary carbon market work, they're investing in developing countries and in rich countries, various investments in protecting forests and restoring land and doing all kinds of other things. At the same time, there's evidence that some are actually being quite harmful. And so we've got a really remarkably well-qualified panel here. We've got Suzanne DiBianca sitting here in the middle, who I'm going to ask the first question to, who is with Salesforce. But in addition to that, she is a leader in the Trillion Trees program. So I want to start with you, and then I'll introduce the rest of you as we go along, I think. Very, very interesting report just come out by the World Economic Forum. I would urge you to look at it, and by the Trillion Trees initiative. It's called Embedding Indigenous Knowledge in the Conservation and Restoration of Landscapes. And this is one very, very important element of the issue. So potential unintended damage can be ecological in nature, but it will also refer to human rights issues and social issues and just inappropriate failure to engage with indigenous people. And that's why I'm so happy we have Helena here, Gualinga, who is a leader of a youth movement for indigenous people. And we're going to ask her to say some words a little bit later on. Since I've introduced two of you, maybe I'll introduce all four of you now. Katherine Garrett-Cox at the far end is an investor as a CEO of GIB Asset Management. But in addition to that, she's chair of CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, as it used to be called, which is the place where you record the emissions each year. And then finally, we've got Luiz de Amaral, who is also Brazilian, but for today's purpose, he is the CEO of the Science Based Targets Initiative. And of course, the SBTi is the place you go to set your target. So we've got some pretty relevant people on the panel here. Suzanne, Salesforce has been a leader in so many aspects on climate. But if you could say just a word about how you're engaging in nature, and how do you think about this tough issue of greenwashing, making sure standards are high, not slowing things down? Over to you. And by the way, the way we're going to organize this, they're going to speak for 2 or maximum 3 minutes each, and then we're going to open it up to a conversation for everybody can ask questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for moderating, and inspired to be here with my fellow panelists. Salesforce is focused on 3 things, really primarily as it relates to climate. Net zero now. We have we've built an incredible technology product that enables transparency, which I think is key to the greenwashing conversation. The second is nature positive. A Trillion Trees has been a complete pleasure to work on, and we had the opportunity to celebrate our success collectively yesterday at that effort, being at 125 billion against a very aggressive target. And the third is ecopreneurs and investing in incredible entrepreneurs that are working on climate solutions. So, as that relates to nature, there's just a few things that I kind of want to underline. The first is, transparency is key. And when we think about we've made 100 million commitment just within our own company against the trillion tree goal. And we put up a website called salesforce.trees.com. It's actually white labeled. Many of our corporate partners can also use this technology, but it sort of demonstrates where we're investing over time. And you can read about the projects. So again, we think transparency builds trust, and we want to be really out there with what we're doing. Same on the ecopreneur side. We've invested in a great entrepreneur, many, Silvera, which is a rating agency. So now in the carbon markets, we're starting to see sort of layers to try to get to the quality issue. They use LiDAR and satellite technology to measure and rate these projects on the ground. Calyx is another one. So we're continuing to look at quality as being really paramount. And to your point about having an honest conversation, yesterday we were approached by a reporter to ask us about our participation in a project where they had found some human rights abuses. And we had pulled ourselves out of that project in 2020 because we couldn't get verified data. And I think that from a corporate's perspective, I don't know how many people in the room have saw the John Oliver piece on the carbon markets. If you haven't, you should watch it. But it scared a lot of corporates. Really called out people for projects that they unknowingly had, that in some cases were hunting lodges that were already in nature preserves. But what I learned from that, and I just spent some time in London with Helen Clarkson, who runs the climate group, who I adore, and I hadn't thought about it from this perspective. She's the founder of Climate Week. And she said, when corporations don't talk, we can't do our jobs. We don't know where to focus our efforts. We can't properly lobby in partnership with corporations. So it really hinders us from the work that we have to do. And I'd never thought about it through that lens, but Andrew and I were just on another panel together, and my mantra in this area is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. We have got to go fast, and as much as we can, we've got to continue to bring transparency to the effort.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Katherine, the investment community wants to do the right thing, but you can't be monitoring, on the front lines yourselves. You need some system of information. Talk about what you need.
So in your kind introduction, you said I come wearing two hats, which is true. So on the one hand, GIB Asset Management, we're a London-based asset manager, very much focused around scaling capital, supporting sustainable development, specifically for a number of our investors based in the Middle East. The other hat I wear, as you said, Andrew, is I'm very honored to chair CDP, which for more than 20 years has pioneered data in the environmental reporting space. So I think that the debate this week has been, I suppose, quite interesting, because people are very easy to give up on ESG and sort of move on. And we know that actually when you look at market participation and action over the last 12 months, if you were investing in that space, you probably haven't done so well. So you're probably having a bit of a hard time from your board, your clients saying, what on earth are you thinking? What I would say is keep the faith, because there is a period of time when all markets have a cycle. And I think what we look for as investors is increasingly to call out those companies that aren't doing the right thing. And let me be honest, my real sense is greenwashing has many faces, but one of them hides behind a veil of simplicity. Well, what do I mean by that? It's because initially people were very quick to report on things that were easy to do. But as an investment company, when you then go and scratch below the surface, you then found that quite a lot of what they're doing just wasn't substantiated. And hence why, as you indicated, Andrew, Certain corporates are stepping back. They're sort of going back under the radar with this green hushing idea, which actually, isn't the answer at all. Equally, there's been a real phenomenon across Europe where investment strategies, investment funds that were set up to help investors participate in things like nature-based solutions and the whole move towards supporting companies addressing climate change, a number of them weren't doing what they said they were doing on the tin. And undoubtedly, people have started to call them out. So under sustainable finance regulation, big asset managers, not just in Europe but across the world, have stepped back from saying that their funds are the highest rating, which would be Article 9 under European regulation. And actually what you've seen in the last quarter of 22 was that funds who still were doing what they said they were doing attracted new money, and everybody else saw money run out the door because people suddenly realized that the emperor had no clothes. So at GIB, we're really tackling this in two ways. Firstly, we're stepping up to actually do what we say we're doing. So we're supporting a number of initiatives. And actually with Salesforce, we've been part of Friends of Ocean Action for some years. We've issued 4 papers on blue finance, really trying to work out how can we scale and get private sector investment into a space that to date has been relatively unfunded. We're also involved in the Mangroves Working Group. Unsurprisingly, the Middle East is a part of the world upon which they depend on mangroves. And so we're very much involved in those 2 initiatives. And my last point, coming back to what investors are looking for, I come with a CDP hat on. As I said, we've been a reporting depository for organizations, cities, investors for more than 20 years. But last year, just before Montreal, when we were really trying to focus on biodiversity, we issued a questionnaire to around 8,500 organizations as to whether they could disclose what they were doing around nature. The good news is 90% of them came back and said, we're doing some cool things, we have plans to do this, that, and the other. The less good news is that really only half of them have done anything. And so my personal sense is that the way forward, which is where Luiz comes in, is we just have to live in a world where mandatory reporting is going to become more relevant. It isn't enough to be sort of voluntary and hope that no one calls you out. And investors will look to the data because the theory of change that CDP believes in is disclosure drives insight, and insight drives action. And action is what investors want to see on the ground.
Well said. Thank you very much, Katherine. It's great to have Helena Gualinga here. She is the co-founder of the Indigenous Youth Collective for the Amazon, and you're based in Ecuador, I believe. Tell us just a little bit about your organization, but then what your concern is and how you see this issue.
Yeah, well, I come from an indigenous community called Sarayaku in the Ecuadorian Amazon. We have a very long history of fighting big oil. 10 years ago now, we were able to also kick out big oil from our community, so we do have no oil exploration in our territories. Despite that, despite really important regulation being happening in Ecuador when it comes to indigenous people's rights, after that, we still have threats to our territories. And we still have threats to our territories because we have neighbors that have threats to our to their territories. So what the youth collective focuses on, it's a group of young people. We all come from different nations and different communities across the Ecuadorian Amazon. We all face different types of threats. Amongst them are deforestation, mining, oil, and hydroelectric power stations, actually. One of my best friends, him and his community, the young people were able to actually kick out an entire company on their own just like 4 or 5 years ago now. So it's really young people coming together and saying, okay, we're gonna follow in the footsteps of the leaders and the people that have been leading this fight for decades, and we're all standing on the shoulders of the leaders that have come before us. But really a young new generation that is kind of confronting the threats that we're facing. I think something that now that I listened to your discussion, and I've thought about this before, and I wasn't planning on talking about this, but you were talking a lot about how you can track, if there are any human rights violations, if people are actually walking the talk on the ground and your partners, etc. I mean, there has been, in the context of the Amazon and indigenous people's rights, many times we do see human rights violations. I recently had a dear friend to mine was threatened by a quite, very high executive in a mining company face to face, and it was quite brutal words that were used. And when we took this to the company, they said, "Oh, there's some link on the website, and you can report that, and then we'll look at that." And we don't, in the communities, we don't know what links we should use when we should report these kind of atrocities. But what I think there should be is for us to be able to track back to you, right, as investors. Because if you can track to me, there is not a lot of transparency when you go really, really down, right? And that's why you had to pull out from the projects where, you found human rights violations, or you didn't find transparency. You couldn't actually, check what was happening. So why don't create the tool for indigenous people, for people on the ground to actually track back to you and let you guys know? Not some random link on a website, but actually an entire tool, an entire mechanism that making sure that we can track back every single step back to you. I think, going back to kind of restoration and restoration projects and conservation, the most efficient way of actually conserving and protecting ecosystems, bodies of water, forests, is giving indigenous people rights and making sure that indigenous rights are guaranteed. Making sure that we have our territorial rights, that our lands are demarcated, that we have the control over what happens in our territories. And I mean, you're the data guy, but if we look at data, if we look at numbers, it actually shows that the most preserved places in the world are under indigenous custodianship. So it is the most efficient way. We don't need new technology to save the rainforest, for example. It's there, and I always say this: it's the only thing that we want in my community, at least, is that no one comes there and cuts down the tree, and that's the most simple solution. Of course, we need support to implement other projects when it comes to healthcare, education, etc. But it's quite simple when it comes to conservation, and we just need people to let the rainforest, let the forest stay without touching them. And when it comes to restoration, we talk about indigenous inclusion and indigenous people being consultated. But it doesn't work like that in our communities. We have our own structures of governance. We have our own structures of decision making. We have quite developed structures of decision making and of governance. And that needs to be taken into account when these projects are wanting to collaborate with indigenous people. And that is making sure indigenous people are actually at the center of decision making, not being consulted after the decisions have already been made. And that is really respecting the self-determination and autonomy of indigenous people.
Great, thank you, Helena, very much. Yeah, I mean, evidence is just mounting, I'm sure everybody knows this, that when indigenous people who manage, 60% of the world's land, even though it may only have 2 or 3% of the world's population, something like 60 or 70% of the biodiversity is that. When groups of indigenous people have legal rights and the ability to protect those rights, the deforestation reduces enormously. Just a mounting evidence from institutions like the World Resource Institute, like Rights and Resources Institute, academic institutions. It's just a fact that we need to embed in all our thinking. And by the way, this report, again, is really very good on sort of precisely the kind of thoughts that Helena laid out so very well. Luiz, how do you see this as you well, of course, you're close to some of these issues from where you live, but as the CEO of the SBTi.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and such an honor to be in such a distinguished panel and sharing those thoughts with such a inspiring leadership. So obviously, as you said from the beginning, I'm a little biased on this topic, having worked for 15 years, and as you already hinted, being Brazilian, on trying to protect forests and promote better land use in my country. But today, either on a not-for-profit, trying to use remote sensing to protect forests, or on a bank trying to promote better practices for farmers, or in the industry trying to regulate that. That was my life for 15 years. But for the past year, now my life is leading Science-Based Targets Initiative. And what we do is work within different sectors to try to define what good corporate climate action looks like from all of the sectors all across the globe. The idea is exactly to define, to avoid that like corporate climate action becomes a storytelling competition, helping companies define from the start what success looks like. So then it's very easy, it's very harmonized what success looks like, and then you know and you can evaluate progress towards that, right? And you do that by two ways. We develop the guidances of what good looks like based on the best available science. And it's difficult, I must say, because we were trying to translate complex scientific concepts into actionable corporate insights. It's navigating the edge of knowledge, but that's what innovation looks like. And then the second thing is that we evaluate if companies' plans adhere to those practices, right? So this is what SBTi does, and in all sectors, including food and agriculture, and including other sectors that can use nature-based solutions as means to also implement that. To that point, then we come to this point of the discussion today, right? About promoting restoration, promoting nature-based solutions, and how do you guarantee as you said, the speed and scale of guaranteeing that we're guaranteeing the investments are flowing, but we also have the guardrails in place to guarantee that unintended consequences, as Helena rightfully presented, are met. So there's supply and demand. So there's one issue, which is supply. What are the good investments? What are the good projects? And to that, I'm not going to talk. Helena is much better positioned than myself, and there are others that are working on what does good investment look like on nature-based solutions. And then there's the demand side, which is what are the good demand for that type of investments? That's where we come, right? Because what we try to do with those guidances is really define what good looks like. So what are the actions that a company needs to take within their supply chains? Because that's what they need to do first, is mitigate their own business cases. And then what do they do beyond their value chains? And what do they do to support other projects that maybe are thousands of kilometers away from their operations to guarantee that? So that's where we focus on, is guaranteeing that that demand also has the credibility that is needed for those projects.
Oh, terrific. Thank you very much indeed. I want to be open now to questions, so at any stage feel free to raise your hand. But I'm going to ask just one question before as they're thinking about their questions. I'll skip to you, Suzanne, and others may have a thought. The Trillion Trees is a wonderful initiative of the World Economic Forum, and you've been very heavily engaged in it, and I hope later on Nicole Schwab might just say a word about it. Obviously, it's possible to do this wrong, so you need a system in place. I mean, you could be, big industrial, plantations in places where just not paying enough attention either to the ecosystem or to inhabitants of that particular area. Could you say a word about sort of how that process happens and what gives you confidence? Because it's impressive the way I think you're thinking this through. And by the way, the Trillion Trees, if you want a sort of way of thinking about this, which is simplistic, but it's actually useful. There used to be 6 trillion trees in the world. There now are 3 trillion trees in the world. So this will add 1 trillion trees by, is it 2030?
2030.
2030. That's a pretty exciting vision if you think about it. Anyway, over to you.
And sequester about 250 gigatons of carbon.
Wow.
And trees, mangroves are really important in the solution. We had a breakfast this morning with PE firms called Money in Mangroves, and we need more investment. The way that we think about it, our mantra, sort of right tree, right place, right time, right people. And I think there is a danger to have monocrops. That's not what's important. We've been incredibly privileged to be guided on this journey by Dr. Jane Goodall. Conservation is first. It's the most important thing. We need old growth. But we think about it is, there are so many biodiversity, we have a crisis in biodiversity, regardless of climate change at some level. And if we just take mangroves as an example, that's a food source for many populations, and it provides jobs, it provides storm protection. There's so many things outside of just the carbon sequestration that's really important. And I really agree with Helena. Like it sort of reminds me of the days of microlending when Muhammad Yunus sort of focused on women as a way to funnel loans because they had a much higher payback rate. They know, just naturally what to do. Indigenous people know exactly what to do. They have the right tools, already have had for hundreds of years. And so just empowering local people to make this effort theirs is just such an important part of the criteria. So when we assess these projects, we look at all of those things. We look at biodiversity, we look at jobs, we look at food, we look at, is this a project that's being driven by the local community and not an agricultural company, as an example.
Yeah. That's it.
One thing I just want to also say is TNFD. So we've just hosted a workshop in our London office that there's now kind of a movement, the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. There's now a movement to put the same in for nature. And so we brought together a number of our customers. We're a software company. We don't have a huge impact on nature. We have some things with water in our data centers, but we also don't own most, our data centers. So, we did our own sort of assessment, but we're thinking about it more on behalf of our customers. And this product that I mentioned, how do we put in the standards for nature that we need to really be able to track them over time? So I just wanted to, he was supposed to be also on this panel, but I'm very impressed with the work that they're doing in that area.
Yes, indeed. And 5 years from now, we need the same disclosure on nature as we now require for carbon, and as some decades ago we required for financial issues. The floor's open. Who'd like to ask a question? Yes, and just say who you are.
Yes, can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me? So I'm Jen Jenkins. I'm with Rubicon Carbon. We're a company that has just launched recently, actually, with a goal to scale the carbon market for just this kind of investment. I'm really interested in this conversation about greenwashing for two reasons, right? I think I see two main barriers, things that we hear from our customers and our potential customers as we're talking to them about the solutions that we offer. The first one is they're incredibly afraid, right? And they are afraid because in many cases, right? So some of the projects that we own and participate in are RED Plus projects, right? These are 30-year projects. So they might be 10 years in, and you don't know. There's a journalist sort of lurking in the corner who's ready to pull out a negative report, on the basis of maybe interviewing one or two folks from the community, or somebody who is disgruntled for some other reason might sort of, and then that journalist will prepare a negative report and completely blindside everyone involved, and make the companies that invested in that project look bad. They've been with the best of intentions, in investing in what they believe is, and what the certifying organizations and the registries have endorsed as a legitimate project. I would love, it's extremely frustrating, and I would love to hear this group sort of expound on that particular type of phenomenon. How can we sort of provide support to companies that are trying to do the right thing, but really end up sort of getting dragged into this counterproductive conversation, in my view.
Thank you.
The second, if I just one more thing, I think the other, and actually at WEF yesterday, a report was released that was co-written by Bain and the World Economic Forum, and it did identify a few sort of barriers to the carbon market. And one of them, and I would love to hear from Mr. Amaral, is the interpretation that companies are making of the SBTi guidance around investing in offsets has actually had what I believe is probably the opposite impact that was intended, right? It's actually chilling the market. Companies are choosing not to invest now in offsets because they believe, for whatever reason, that the guidance tells them not to buy offsets until the year before the rates are returned.
Gotcha. So who'd like to take the first question, essentially, which is, you know, good journalism should expose bad things, but sometimes journalists, you know, seize onto a story that might be very micro level and it's sort of generalized. I mean, presumably, that's why we need data that is verified, that we can actually know the truth. Is that right, Katherine?
I was actually going to make that very point, that I think it really comes down to the integrity and authenticity of the data. So I think, firstly, I think data has slightly failed this generation in some senses, which is why a lot of people hopped on various different bandwagons. Companies are very quick to sign up to certifications of all sorts. But sometimes, as I said, you know, when you scratch below the surface, it's not really there. I would say specifically from a corporate perspective, having come from a place where I was running a PLC, sometimes there's safety in numbers. So if you can perhaps marshal a group of people who've gone through similar experiences to share learnings, that's a really great place to start, because knowledge can really help you avoid making the same mistakes. So that might be one thing, just to try to sort of build a bit of a coalition of people who are a bit afraid, put it on the table and see what you can do. But I think the responsibility of the data providers is to make sure that investors who are frankly parting with money, fiduciary money or private money from a family office or whatever, need to make sure that that data is truly authentic and stands the test of scrutiny. And that's why organizations such as CDP are so important. And one of the things we're really working on is, you know, how can we broaden the scope of the work and the data that we've been gathering over the last 20 years? And how do we make sure that it's accessible? Because if it's not accessible, then no one knows. And so those would be sort of my two Ps for what it's worth. And your point on offsetting is spot on, but Luiz, I'm not going to veer off into your space. Although
Luiz,
sort of,
are you having a chilling effect on carbon?
yeah.
I think, as we said at the beginning, Andrew, we are navigating the edge of knowledge, right? We're trying to do stuff that was never done before, and it comes with a little bit bumps on the road that we quickly need to adapt. And one of those, as Jen pointed out, is that there is a misreading and a misperception of that. So I'll make two comments on to that specific question while answering Jen's. So the first, just clarify, thank you for the question, because I think I really wanted to touch that, but in 3 minutes I didn't have the time. Now you gave me enough time to do that.
1 minute.
In 1 minute. Fantastic. SBTi is not against carbon markets, quite the contrary, right? What the misinterpretation of reading said is that the net zero standard says that at the end of your net zero journey, there will always be emissions. And those emissions at the end of the journey, by that time, you absolutely will be obliged to compensate them through removals. And why removals? Because by then, we have to have solved deforestation. If you haven't, we're in a different type of position, right? That's what it says. And folks understood that it was saying, oh, you can only use carbon credits and only investments, only at the end, and only for removals. That's not right? What it's saying is it's obligatory at the very end to compensate for your residual emissions. That's one thing. The other thing that we say is you cannot buy your way out of your corporate climate plans, meaning you cannot continue to grow your emissions forever, just go out there in the market and offset everything with the carbon markets. That's the other thing, which is true because we want to transform businesses. But then what we say is that we strongly encourage the investments and folks to go above and beyond their own plans, invest in nature, invest in carbon markets, if the two other requirements are met. We're currently developing a beyond value chain mitigation guidance because we recognize there was this lack of interpretation. So we want to facilitate that because we all want more investments into those things. So we are working on that new guidance that is actually going to bring more clarity, Jen, to this type of misinterpretation. So this was just on that question. And finally, Andrew, if I have 30 seconds more to your question, I would say that we are actually facilitating carbon markets and investments. We were all there 15 years ago when was the first gold rush of carbon markets, right? And we all know what happens. Crashed. I remember at the time I was doing carbon markets. I was in the bank investing and creating a project to restore lands. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, we were one of the first voluntary restoration goals that we were doing at the time. When the project started, all the math was good. At the end, the prices had crashed. It was not even worth to get the auditors to go out there in the field and see if the...
Right.
And that happened because demand disappeared. So what SBTi does is actually it creates a demand, right? We are actually helping regulate the market by guaranteeing that demand will exist for that, not only now, in the future to avoid that crash in the future.
And one reason that demand disappeared is because the quality of supply was weak, and they were, which is what we want to avoid this time around. Other questions? Yes, back there. Maybe we'll take a couple if there are. Yes, go ahead and say who you are.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Rima Chakrabarti. Thank you all for being here. I'm an investor in early stage biotech, now starting to focus more on biology-based solutions for climate change. A question I have on carbon credit and verification. Suzanne, you had mentioned investing in a company that's focused on tracking, and you know, there are methodology tracking agencies like Vera, for example, where a number of our companies are actually going through the methodology process with them. And something that happens with all regulation is it takes time. And so there is often at odds this relationship between moving fast, innovating fast, and then being at odds with the time scale of regulation. Knowing how important quality is to this, I mean, that's what we've been talking about, things around permanence and the actual size of the offset and all of these other points you all understand better than I do. How do we balance the speed of solving this problem with regulation? Is it by relying on a number of third parties to regulate? Is there at some point a central agency, which gut tells me will take longer to regulate? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well done. Well, we could be here all day on this subject. Anybody want to give a crisp answer to that?
I think we do need a global standard. I am glad about the regulation in Europe. It's looking different in the US. I think we need one global standard. I'm a deep believer in that. I also just want to say, you know, there's good systems for transparency today, and they're getting better every day. So Forest Watch, under the World Resource Institute, has been incredible at this, and Andrew would know this more so than I, but has been at this, I think, for a decade in trying to really bring transparency. And there's a program that you can talk about if you want to around the Carbon and Land Lab, which I'm fascinated about. So we've got so much better technology today that we can do this fast and good and get better, sort of the evolution.
Yeah, I mean, these are early days, and your point is absolutely right. You know, there is a need to go fast, but it takes too long, and some of the investments will require a bit of time, but once you get them in place, then you'll be able to do lots of them quickly. So, for example, on nature-based solutions, you really want a jurisdictional approach.
Yeah.
Project by project might be quicker, but the quality won't be so good. Once you've got a jurisdictional approach, you've got the governments with plans that you can monitor. And as Suzanne says, we now have, for example, the Land and Carbon Lab, which Bezos Earth Fund supports, and WRI and various other organizations run it. I mean, we will be able to know 3 years from today, not only every tree that's falling in the world, basically, 10 meters by 10 meters everywhere on the Earth's planet every month or so. We'll also know trees that are growing. We'll be able to capture that. We'll be able to see crops that are changing, land use that's changing, and we'll be able to see the carbon embedded in all of those transitions. So for the first time ever, we'll be able to get the so-called carbon flux at the hectare by hectare level. Well, you think about what that will enable us to do. It won't be perfect to start with, but over the years, because of the way that you have sort of continuous learning algorithms and ground truthing that helps get the better algorithms through drones and so on, we'll get really quite good. We have to head towards the end of the session now. I'm going to ask each of you to say one thing that you plan to do in the coming year that you think would help us get more clarity on this issue that we've been discussing today. Should we start at the far end, Katherine?
Thanks, Andrew.
Then that's right, because whoever goes first is hardest, isn't it?
So since you put me on the spot, I'm going to go for two things I'm going to do with my two different hats on, which I think is only fair. So with my CDP hat on, we are going to relentlessly pursue better reporting around biodiversity. And absolutely, I think touching on Suzanne's point about TNFD, I think, creating the standard and making sure it becomes mandatory, we're all in for that. In terms of my GIB asset management hat on, we are absolutely committed to continuing to support the Mangroves Working Group, the Blue Ocean Agenda, and trying to crowd in more private sector financing, because it's not one person that can tackle all of this. So bring authenticity, bring money to bear on the scale of the problem. That's what we'll do.
Well said. Thank you. Luiz.
I think we were going to do two things, Andrew. One is guarantee that growth on SBTi, which is growth of demand for this type of investments, right? So companies that get targets instead to say, here's what I want to achieve, those are the ones that are actually going to be triggered to be investing into those solutions. We had, last year when I was here at WEF, we had 2,000 companies committed. Now we have 4,000 companies committed, 2,000 companies out of which have already validated. So it doubled the size. That exponential growth needs to continue to guarantee that this wave of additional investments on nature exists, including companies that will do that outside their supply chains, such as yourselves, but also the food and agricultural companies that need to do that inside their supply chains. This is one. And then the second thing, we're working, as I mentioned, on this new guidance, which we call very jargony, we need better names, but beyond value chain mitigation. Is exactly to Jen's point, to try to clarify more and more to the marketplace, what are the incentives of these incentive structures, what are the guidance and standards on how to do best the investments when they're not within your operations and then they're far away.
Thank you very much.
And I'll just do one thing with both hats, which is really be guided by youth, in particular, in Indigenous communities, as decision-making bodies. One, we were talking earlier about Earth Uprising, which is a group I'm very involved in. And the founder of that was inspired to set it up as a result of forest fires and asthma. And I'm just incredibly humbled. I'm impressed deeply by the work of young people, and I think they deserve a seat at the table. I'm appreciative to give panels and all of the things to get voice and out there, but I actually want to take a different approach next year, and I think Nicole and I are on the same page as it relates to the 1T effort, but for Salesforce, I'm going to give a youth council my business plan and say what's missing, what makes sense, and I really want more youth voices in like the decision-making context.
Wow. That's wonderful. Well, that's a very natural segue. Helena, over to you.
Yeah, I agree, and I think young people and Indigenous people need to be at the tables where decisions are being made. Otherwise, we have seen a lot of failure before. We need to change strategy. We need to make sure that we have new people on these tables making decisions. I think. Andrew, I think my commitment can be to hold all of you accountable. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Good, great. A short sentence, but with real content to it.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Look, we have to bring this to an end now. I'm struck by the sort of genuineness of this conversation. And it's one thing, I'd commend you, Nicole, and the WEF team for this, we're really having very genuine conversations. Yesterday we had a brilliant session bringing renewable energy investors together with the miners that find those precious minerals that are required in order to build a windmill, together with the nature community. And on the issue essentially of permitting, and everything, it's the point about things going slow. It's a brilliant, sort of transparent, honest confrontation. It's exactly where we ought to be right now. And it seems to me that coming out of this session, some things should be absolutely non-negotiable. So engaging in the right way with Indigenous people, as is sort of suggested here, that should be non-negotiable. No trade-offs there. And we need to, the overwhelming message is data and verifiable data. I was struck by your question about, a journalist does a story and how do you defend against it? Well, imagine an equivalent. Suppose the journalist does a story on your finances. Salesforce is a great big hole in its finance. What would you do? You wouldn't try and defend it. You'd go and talk to the auditors who audited the accounts, and you'd talk to the accountants, and you'd say, where is it true? And you'd be able to see it either is true or isn't true. And if it is true, you fire the auditors. If it isn't true, then the journalist has no story. We're baby steps at the moment. Fair enough, we've only been in this business for 10 years, but we need, over the next decade, to get to that situation where we could have that degree of transparency and verifiability. So thank you. Nicole, why don't you end us?
Thank you very much, Andrew. I want to thank the panelists, and thank you for this parallel as well with the financial sector. So we're very much committed at the World Economic Forum to everything that's been said here, to accountability, to transparency, to trust, but also to this transition towards a nature positive net zero economy. And with OneT.org, we've also just released the first set of 30 implementation reports from the 80 pledges that we have today. The first 30 have released a kind of a tracking of where their implementation is at in partnership with the IUCN Restoration Barometer. So we now have a mechanism for the private sector to track their pledges. And I think this and everything you've heard here are all examples of efforts that can help us bring more transparency in the system and thereby encourage more companies to join, because they know that what will be highlighted are the good efforts and kind of this recognition for the positive efforts. And moving us away from the greenwashing. And scrutiny is a good thing. So we actually welcome this additional scrutiny so that we can recognize what good looks like. So we want to invite all of you to join this movement and to join OneT.org and our other initiatives at the forum. And if you have any questions, of course, please reach out to us. We are here to support this transition. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you, Katherine, Luiz, Suzanne, Helena. Well done.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.